Good morning, everybody. Buen dia, bom dia. Excuse my voice. I've been traveling a lot in the last month, and I'm still recovering from a cold. So it's my pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to see that there's a whole community of Latin American people out there just like me. I'm from Argentina, by the way, but I've been living in the UK for a very long time now. My talk today is not going to be a very technical talk. So you won't see numbers or equations or architecture diagrams. I'm going to make it easy for you in the morning. My idea for today is actually to show you how we use NLP to help with tasks in language assessment. So for those of you who might not be familiar with tasks within the language assessment realm, I'm going to show you the kind of things that we do and hopefully go through some of the techniques and how people have been solving these tasks, then to touch upon some other issues like a bit of ethics and also what I think is going to happen in the future. So the idea for this talk is to be a bit more motivational and informational rather than teaching you anything particularly new about how to build models. Okay, so let's start with something visual. So I'd like to know if you know what this is. Do you recognize this? Do you have any idea what this is? Have you ever seen anything like that before? Sorry, parsing. Did you say anything like syntactic parsing? Okay. So this is a rule taken from a rule-based system that looks for subject-verb agreement errors. So this is taken from a system that has over 6,300 rules like this. So you can imagine how difficult, time-consuming, and painstaking it is to build a system like this. How about this one? Do you know what this is? Have you ever seen anything like this? I'm sorry, I can't really hear. Errand? No. Um, those of you, those of you that worked on translation perhaps might know what this is. This is an excerpt from a phrase table from a statistical machine translation system that has been repurposed to do grammatical error correction. So you can see this attempts to correct from incorrect English to correct English. There was a period in time around 2013 to 2018 where people working on grammatical error correction would repurpose a statistical machine translation systems to this task. So this is an example of a phrase translation system for grammatical error correction. And finally, I assume you know this one, what it looks like. ChatGPT, right? Um, so we are very familiar with this nowadays. So what I like about this particular slide is that, so again, this is another way of doing grammatical error correction, but the prompt that I use for this slide is actually a prompt that was suggested by ChatGPT itself. So I basically asked ChatGPT, can you generate the best prompt you can to turn you into a grammatical error correction system? And this is what it came up with. So as you can see in just 3 slides, I kind of showed you the evolution, in this case, of grammatical error correction systems throughout the years. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because, in particular, grammatical error correction is one of the key tasks in language assessment. The other most common task is essay scoring, automated essay scoring, which you might know by other names as well. But within language assessment, we have lots of other tasks as well. And I'm going to show you some of them now. Now, what is language assessment in particular? So when we talk about language assessment, we talk about measuring constructs. Do any of you know what a construct is? Have you ever heard the word construct? No? Okay. So a construct is a skill, is an ability that we try to measure. And this is an ability that we can't, it's not directly observable. It's not something that we can measure or quantify very easily. It's not directly measurable, so to speak. So in general, the way that we measure these contracts is through testing. So we use testing as a proxy for estimating constructs, right? How to measure a construct. So typical constructs that we have in language assessment are reading comprehension, grammatical accuracy, writing ability, listening comprehension, oral proficiency, and there are many, many more. So these are things that we have to estimate through testing. We can't directly observe somebody's writing ability. We have to make up an idea of how well they write just by giving them tests or watching them write. What other constructs can you think of? What other things within language assessment, language proficiency estimations, would be other constructs, things that we can't measure directly, but we have to do through testing? What other things do you think we could measure in terms of language ability? Sorry? Reasoning could be, yes. Sorry? I didn't.
Sorry, I mean, rhetoric.
Okay, yeah. So we can measure things like communicational ability, interaction, what we call mediation, for example, how well somebody can interpret a piece of text and so on. There are lots of abstract concepts, abstract abilities that we can measure. Now, in order to automate some of these measurements, we resort to NLP and AI in general. So how can we use NLP to measure these constructs? Well, the first two most prominent and important assessments that we want to carry out using NLP are writing assessment and speaking assessment. And the reason why we need AI or NLP to assess these things automatically is because unlike other constructs, we can't measure these things using what we call objective measuring. So, for example, for something like reading comprehension, we can come up with some piece of text and some multiple choice questions, and then it's very easy to know whether somebody chose the right answers. But for something like speaking or writing, we don't have that ability. So we have to actually try to understand what the person wrote, the kind of language that they use, and so on. So it's much more complex. So these are tasks that we call productive tasks, right? Writing and speaking are productive tasks, unlike reading and listening that are receptive tasks, right? So we try to use NLP for assessing these productive skills. And that means that we have to start solving lots of other subtasks in order to be able to measure those bigger constructs. So some of the things that we have to do is, for example, assess vocabulary, do grammatical error correction, or do essay scoring, assess task completion, whether somebody has been able to achieve a task, communication skills, analyze coherence and cohesion, and so on. And just like we do this for these productive skills, we also try to do certain things for receptive skills, things like reading and listening. Although, as I mentioned, it's much easier to score these kind of tasks. However, we might want to use NLP or AI to work on some auxiliary tasks, like, for example, adapting the texts for these tasks, or doing localization, so try to adapt this to the cultural environment of the test taker, or do what we call item difficulty estimation, try to see if a piece of text, for example, or a listening exercise is at the appropriate level for the population that we want to test on. So as you can see, every time that you want to work on one particular task, then lots of other subtasks start to pop up. And if we dig deeper, then we find that there are even more tasks that we need to solve. So we start coming into more niche subtasks every time, and we can keep adding. And then in order to solve these tasks, we need to rely on general NLP tasks like parsing or automatic speech recognition. So this starts to branch out into lots of tasks and more tasks and more. So it never ends. There's always something else that you find yourself you need to do in order to solve something bigger. So it's not surprised that you will see lots of papers working on very niche subtasks in order to solve these bigger problems. And what I find particularly fascinating is how many groups of researchers work on the same topics without calling what they're doing by the same name. So often you find things. I took this from a paper that is about natural language generation and how researchers working on natural language generation use different terms to actually refer to the same thing. But this is something that happens, I would say, in all different fields, subfields of NLP. And language assessment is not exempt. So you can see, for example, how what some people consider to be fluency actually is grammaticality, or what some people think is naturalness. It's actually fluency. So you start seeing that, people start using different terms. In the case of language assessment, people would refer to things like essay scoring by other names like auto marking or auto scoring or automated marking. Like, you start seeing all these same varieties of the same thing, but they're solving the same basically. So sometimes it can be a bit hard to navigate what they're doing if they don't really use the same terms. Now, why is this important? Who wants to use AI for language assessment? Well, language assessment, language learning, and so on, it's a very big market. So there are lots of companies that are actually interested in developing this technology because it's obviously a commercial opportunity for them, but also because they provide, for example, tests that are aimed at providing certifications, for example, that are used in what we call high stakes scenarios. So scenarios where these examinations have a very high impact on somebody's life. For example, they will determine whether you will be accepted at a university or whether you can get a job and so on. So it's very important that if we develop this technology and we use this technology, we do it right. So this is just to show you some of the big organizations that use AI at the moment for some of their high stakes examinations. So we can see, for example, a TOEFL exam, Pearson examinations, Duolingo with their Duolingo English test. And we also see LinguaSkill by Cambridge and the primary English test by the British Council. That's a test for young learners, people in primary education. And in all these cases, these organizations use AI for the scoring of speaking and writing ability in all these cases. In other cases, like, for example, Duolingo and Cambridge as well for LinguaSkill, they use NLP also to help with the adaptation capability of the test. So while you're taking the test, it can assess what your proficiency is during the test and maybe challenge you by giving you an exercise that is more difficult, and then if you don't get that right, it will lower the difficulty of the items, and we'll try to adapt so that you get the best possible score. Sometimes they also use this to generate content. In particular, the case of Duolingo, they use this very heavily to generate reading exercises, listening, and so on. Okay, so where are we now in terms of the technology that we use to develop these tests and auto-scoring solutions and so on? As I showed you, there are lots of tasks that you can work on, so I won't be able to show you the evolution of every single task, but I'm going to touch upon the most prominent ones, things like grammatical error correction and essay scoring. So in terms of essay scoring, well, we've seen throughout the years that things like deep learning, they work very well, and they can achieve near human performance. That means that they can score practically as well as a human examiner. In particular, transformer-based architectures, on some occasions, they can beat human marking agreement. And some papers go as far as to say, this is a very recent paper from Cambridge, that holistic grading is a relatively easy task. So we're talking here about basically a regression task, right? So predicting a score for a piece of writing, for example, is just nothing more than just a regression task. And we know that if we have a decent data set, a very representative data set, we can do that fairly well. Here, the term holistic grading refers to holistic scores. A holistic score is an overall score for a piece of writing or for a transcription of speaking performance. So we're talking about just one score. That's in as opposed to trade scoring, where when you try to generate subscores for different dimensions of writing, for example. So you always score things for grammaticality, or for task completion, or for vocabulary richness, and so on. So when we talk about holistic grading or holistic scores, we mean just one score, final score. That's a relatively easy task. In terms of grammatical error correction, well, neural machine translation and transformers, they can achieve top performance. So this is something we've seen in the last few years. But we also know that people have experimented with LLMs, not just for these tasks, but for all sorts of tasks within NLP. So I think a very natural question to ask is, can we do all of these tasks with LLMs? And does it mean that if we can do these things, LLMs have taken over from traditional machine learning? So let's see. I had a look at some of the papers in the last couple of years, and I'm going to show you some of the results that I found. So, for example, in this paper by Duolingo from last year, they say that GPT-4 can rate essays on the CFI scale fairly accurately. By fairly accurately, we mean something like 80% accuracy, if it is given at least one example per level. So we're talking about using one-shot prompting for essay scoring. By the way, when I talk about the CEFI scale, this is scale that we use to measure linguistic ability. This comes from a European scale of language ability that goes from A1, that means absolute beginner, to C2. So you have A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. So you go from absolute beginner to mastery. So we're talking here about classifying essays, short essays, using a 6-point scale, basically. Then they found that GPT-4 outperforms GPT 3.5, that GPT-4 has no bias for gender, but it can have low agreement when it comes to some L1s. So it means that it's not very accurate depending on the L1 of the test takers. However, they found that none of these systems were able to beat a feature-based, traditional feature-based model. Then there was another paper in 2024 saying that actually, if you fine-tune something like GPT 3.5, it will outperform GPT-4 at predicting discrete scores. And then they also experimented with generating feedback and found that the feedback that it generates can help novice raters generate feedback that would be typical of more proficient and senior raters. And at the same time, it will help senior raters generate more consistent feedback. Then if we talk about grammatical error correction, some initial studies looked at GPT-3 and found that in the beginning, they were able to achieve decent performance compared to existing systems. You could also restrict, with appropriate prompting, you could restrict them to the kind of errors that you wanted to correct. Other papers found that they can actually generate very fluent corrections in particular, while sometimes over-editing. So sometimes we'll correct more than you would expect, but it will make these corrections very, very natural. And other papers found, for example, that in fact there is no single best grammatical error correction system. In general, if you want to achieve state-of-the-art, you have to combine the output of different systems using an ensemble. And then one of the conclusions they found is that still LLMs can't really beat by themselves a combination of any other systems. Then if we look at other tasks, like for example, disco coherence, there was a study that showed that it can achieve coherence ratings very similar to what you would expect from humans. And then I'd like to show you as well how we can use language model, for example, to generate comments and feedback for errors, and how you can help an LLM generate very accurate explanations for particular errors, especially if you feed the LLM with some explicit edits beforehand. Now, the problem with these models is that because they are based on LLMs, we don't really know what they are doing. And in the case of NLP for language assessment, well, for education in general, we tend to want to know how these scores are produced and how the output is produced, because we need to justify why somebody gets a particular score. So, for example, in the case of an exam, we can have a request from a test taker saying, "Can you please explain why I got this score?" And we have to be able to explain this thing. So there are many studies that try to uncover what is going on in LLMs in order to justify their output. So the easiest way in which you could do this is by directly asking this LLM, "Can you please explain how you achieve this result?" And this paper that I'm citing here, it ran an experiment asking the LLM to explain, for example, why certain options in multiple choice questions were wrong, and it managed to explain those better than a human. There are also studies that try to uncover what we call the rubrics, so the marking criteria of scoring solutions, for example, and they have found correlations between neuron activations and the presence of certain features. Researchers think that this is clearly a step towards understanding what kind of decisions these systems are making. And this is pretty much in the line of probing, if you've ever heard the concept of probing. So these are studies that try to look into what it is that neural networks learn at different stages of training. And other people have also looked at how the prompt that you use actually affects performance. So that's another way of looking into how we can uncover the little secrets in this black box. And I've seen this outstanding diagram that shows how slight changes in your prompt can take the accuracy of your model from practically 0 to 8% accuracy. So this is insane. Just by changing some things, you can get a huge difference in performance. Now, what are the challenges that we face when we use LLMs or AI in general? Well, in the case of LLMs, we find that it's very hard to control many times. So it's very hard to make it stick to the task that you want them to solve. They tend to hallucinate. Sometimes it's very hard to reproduce the results because the models change and the temperature change, and they are stochastic. The output is basically stochastic. So it's very hard to reproduce the exact same results, even using the same prompt. Sometimes it can be overkill to solve some tasks. Some tasks you can just solve with training your own models. They can be prompt sensitive, as I've shown you. You change something, a prompt, change the results completely. And there are obviously ethical concerns as well. And then in terms of general AI, there are issues around data. You need proper high-quality data in order to build your own systems. Sometimes some of the models are inadequate. So, for example, if we want to do automated speech recognition, for example, you have to take into account that if you use this for non-native speakers of English, your transcriptions might be overly corrected, so not really accurate for your purpose. And then there are questions around logistics, like, for example, how easy it is to implement these systems, especially LLMs, whether they are very expensive, whether you can run them on smaller platforms like a mobile device, and so on. And there are also ethical concerns, as I mentioned. So you've probably seen lots of horror stories in the news about how data is improperly used by companies. So something that we have to take into account when we build models, especially in the domain of education, is to make sure that we look at ethics from the very beginning when we build systems. And there is one such approach to do this that is called ethics by design. This is the approach, for example, that we take at the British Council. So when we start developing a solution for education, we try to think of and address all the possible ethical concerns when we start working on the models. No, we don't wait until the end to see how it fails. And there are different dimensions that we have to take into account. So things like the respect for human agency. So we always have to respect the human's decisions. We have to be fair in how we assess. So we have to make sure that we minimize biases as much as possible. There has to be transparency. So we have to be able to explain how our models work to the extent possible. Then we have to have accountability and oversight. That means that there has to be a human in the loop, or as we like to call it, a human in the lead, leading these things, someone that is responsible for these systems. And obviously we have to make sure that we also comply with laws and we are aware of the impact of our systems in the environment. So by taking all these things into account, we maximize the chance that we're going to have an ethical system. If we don't do these things, our system might be considered unethical. Now, to move towards the end of my talk and to wrap up. I'm sorry, I went very, very quickly, I know. So let's look at the future. What can we expect from systems in the future? So the way we see it is now with the advancement of new technologies, it's very easy now to move towards a multimodal environment. And we've seen things like, for example, GPT 4.0 and how it enables the use of video input and audio. It's very easy to do these things nowadays. Well, to some extent, at least. The same goes for multilinguality. So LLMs in particular, they can speak many languages. So this enables the assessment of certain languages that were considered low resource languages before. We are now able to use more natural interfaces, things that were not possible in more traditional examination settings by the use of video or avatars. We can also look into more adaptive and accessible testing. So as I said, for example, we can adapt the questions in a test so that it challenges the user and tries to assess the proficiency by, for example, showing more difficult items and then maybe decreasing the difficulty of the items if they don't perform very well and so on, to find that just perfect sweet spot. Also, we are now, to some extent, moving towards more real-time assessment. So we don't need to wait a long time now to produce scores. And finally, I would like to mention what I call learner models, or what is known as open learner models as well. So if we are now able to build a model, for example, that knows what a test taker knows at different times during a test, or not just during a test, but accompanies them during their whole learning journey, maybe we don't need to have a particular test anymore. We just have a model that learns what a learner knows by looking at the kind of exercises that they do, how well they are performing, what kind of vocabulary they learn, the grammatical structures that they know very well, and so on. So things like apps for language learning, they can do this very well. Or other applications, for example, that look into your writing, they can keep track of how well you've been doing. So if we have these kind of models, then the natural question to ask is, will we need actual exams anymore? If we will now have a model that actually knows what a student knows at all times, so why put them through the pressure of one particular test instance? So I don't have the answer for that, but this is something that I think we're slowly moving towards. And I think this is a very challenging and interesting field. So I would encourage you, if you didn't know much about language assessment, I hope you learned a bit about it today and hopefully want to join forces with us working on this domain. So thank you very much. Muchas gracias. And whatever I can answer, I would be happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariano. We still have 2 or 3 minutes for questions. Do you have any questions you want to share to Mariano?
Hi, thank you. So you said that this is, so there are a lot of entities, like private entities that are interested in this field. What would be, or are there any open data sets or benchmarks related to language assessment? So I don't know a lot about this, so maybe it's a clear yes or clear no.
Yeah,
Thank you.
there are a few. Yes, the problem is that sometimes many of these companies, obviously, understandably, they don't want to release this data sets because
Clearly,
it's crucial
yeah.
information. So I remember, for example, when I was still working at the University of Cambridge, and we were funded by Cambridge Assessment, one of the key players. They have IELTS and other exams. It really was a real struggle to convince them to release some data. We managed to do it. It was a small data set, but yes, there are some. I think, for example, shared tasks are a particular good scenario to encourage the release of these data sets. So yes, there are a few out there. Yeah.
Any other question?
Hi, Mariano. Thank you. My question is not really about the content of the talk. I'm wondering how it feels to be involved in research that's about language learning without being a native speaker. So, I mean, English, I guess we're all speaking English here, so it's fine. I come from Japan. If I wanted to get involved in Japanese language learning, I'm not sure it will be easy for me. So can you share how your experience has been teaching, I mean, working on this subject?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. And so yeah, just to make it clear, or as you might know by now, I am not a language assessment expert myself. And it's interesting because I made that clear in every job, every position that I took. Whenever I joined a team, and especially now at the British Council, I always make clear that they knew that I'm not a language assessment expert. And the truth is that if you join these teams as an NLP person, you will not be expected to be a language assessment expert. So they have their own language assessment expertise. So your role will be to actually help develop the models, the NLP models, for example, that they will need to solve these tasks. And just like it happens for any other domain, the fact that you work, let's say, in the biomedical domain doesn't mean that you're a doctor or that you know, right, the core expertise of that particular domain. So it's not really something to worry about. What I do have to say, though, is that like having a passion for the particular domain and task will help a lot. So if you are a bit pedantic about language like I am, it will help a lot. But these teams will have their own language assessment experts. So it's not like you're going to be turned down because you don't know perfect English. It's not like that.
Thank you.
One more question here.
Thank you for the presentation. Some of the things you mentioned at the end, like where's the future going? I was wondering if you conjecture, if you're comfortable sharing where are we not going? Is there something that said definitely this is not going to work out? Let's try to avoid that from an ethical perspective or otherwise.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that, for example, the over-reliance on LLMs is something that we probably shouldn't be doing. And I can tell this from experience. So, for example, at the moment, we're working on something at the British Council, which is more or less secretive. It's out there. There's a beta out there at the moment. No, it's fine. And we see, for example, that we kind of wanted to take a shortcut at some point because we wanted to release something fairly quickly. And we started to rely on LLMs for a lot of things, for assessing things like task completion or whether the user, this is in the context, sorry, this is in the context of assessing speaking ability and having a task where the user would interact with the chatbot in order to achieve a particular task. Now, LLMs are not very good, as I mentioned, are not very good at keeping within boundaries. So it's very difficult for us to make them do something and not deviate from it. And we made the mistake of maybe believing that LLMs could easily stick to the task and assess many aspects of the tasks. And then there was a point, we came to a point where we realized that now we need our own specialized models. So my conclusion was, okay, we can't really over-rely on LLMs for doing everything that we think we need. So that, for me, would be a no-go. Like, don't use like LLMs for everything. And then, obviously, in terms of ethical issues, every time, for example, you use an LLM, you're giving your data away to companies. So you have to make really sure that, you know, they don't use this data for things that you don't want them to use it for. And especially you have to make test takers aware of that too. So that is a risk. So that, for me, nowadays, that would be the no-go.
This will be the last question.
Oh, thank God.
Thank you, Mariano, for a wonderful talk. And I know that you work in language assessment, but your talk reminded me of a conversation that I had with someone from Grammarly, that they were saying that, I mean, I like Grammarly in the sense that they tell you where was the mistake. It's not like just putting your paragraph on ChatGPT and just get it corrected somehow. And they were saying how much pressure they had to include artificial intelligence and large language models. Like, it was like they felt that if they were not putting Copilot or like autocomplete, they were going to be out of the business. And I can imagine that in your position, you are like in the British Council, so you don't have to go as fast as others. I mean, you can put your own rules. And I think it's very connected to the Pablo's question, like, where do you don't want to go? So I don't know if you have a comment on that, of like, because when you correct a text, I mean, if we speak Spanish and we want to check something, we also are learning about our mistakes. It's not just about getting the paragraph perfect, or perfect in some sense, because sometimes you don't want to be changed as much. I mean, you want to keep some control on the edition. So I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So in a way, it reminds me of the period when I was doing my PhD, for example, or then a postdoc, that in order to get your paper accepted, you had to include certain keywords. You had to include embeddings. Now you have to include LLMs. So there has to be someone so that you're still in the market share. And we see that in companies as well. So yes, you are like pressured to use technology the whole time. Now, something that we are very clear about at the British Council is that we are not a tech company. And the British Council in particular, they have a reputation that they have to uphold. So we can't really afford to make mistakes, unlike maybe other more adventurous companies that they don't have like a whole reputation in terms of, let's say, international relations or international examinations and so on. So that means that we are very careful in the way that we use technology. And of course, we have to, you know, keep up with the Joneses, and we have to do the same things as others do, because otherwise we will perish as a business. But we take an approach that is user-focused and is not technology-focused. So we only use technology if we think that it's going to help us deliver the product that we want. We won't let ourselves be pushed into using something that we are not comfortable with, or that can cause issues that will cause reputational damage to the organization. So for that reason, from the outside, might seem that we're a bit slow to adopt some technology, but that's because we have a reputation to keep and we want to do it ethically and responsibly.
Awesome. Thank you, Mariano, for taking the time for answering all the questions. Now, everybody, please give a big round of applause to Mariano.
Thank you.